Hi, everyone. It is Simon Mainwaring here. I'm the CEO and founder of WeFirst, a strategic consultancy here in Los Angeles that drives growth for purpose-driven brands. And welcome to today's webinar. And most importantly, this webinar is about you. We do these webinars to share information that comes from our consulting practice, and it's to empower you to succeed, to drive growth, to scale your impact. And part of that is answering your questions. So throughout the webinar, please go down to the dialog box at the bottom, and you actually just click on the Q&A button and the chat will come up, and you can put your questions into that chat. So make sure you do that whenever you like through the webinar. Now, today's topic is new capitalism, purposeful business, and what it means for your brand. And I'm excited to have a webinar today because a month ago, we did our webinar with Harvard Business School Association of Boston and those business leaders from 3 large brands, and that was very, very exciting. But this is a chance to get back one-on-one with everyone, and I hope everyone's safe and well during this time of COVID. And obviously, this is a really important topic because, COVID, the Black Lives Matter protests, climate crisis, all of these have thrown into very stark relief, the cost of capitalism outright. Is it working outright, and is it working for everyone? And is it enabling us to have a sustainable or regenerative future, or are we really compromising the planet to the point that we're threatening our own existence, which is why you hear so much talk around, an existential crisis for humanity. So capitalism really sits at the core of all of these issues. And so I want to walk through what's at stake. When you think about it, it's pretty hard to overstate the issue. I mean, this is an apocalyptic photograph from some science fiction film or Blade Runner, the remake. Actually, it's San Francisco in the last couple of months, where the bushfires were such that the smoke filled the sky. And this was actually during the middle of the day, which is just so shocking, to all of us. And at the same time, think about, the oceans, which are really characterized quite rightly as the lungs of the planet. We've got so many issues with ocean acidification, with overfishing, with the fact that, The Guardian reported that by 2050, there'll be more plastic by weight than fish in our oceans. Think about that for a second. And then in addition, we've got the rising crisis of unsustainable agriculture, where, normally arable land that can provide for our crops, the food that we eat, and even for the supply chains that make our clothing and everything we need, are simply being, dramatically compromised by lack of access to water and so on as a function of the climate crisis. And these are just, 3 of the many, many issues. And each one of these issues are very substantive in their own right. But together they are absolutely, catastrophic when they come together. And, if you follow the World Economic Forum each year, they come out with a connectivity report where they actually show how these crises are connected. For example, the climate crisis has an effect on rainfall and so on, which creates a lack of access to water, to irrigate crops and to provide food and so on, which creates climate refugees. People actually have to migrate because they don't have access to water. They can't survive. They don't get the food, the water they need. That then, leads to protectionism, where some countries don't want people from other countries coming in. Or even if they do, it can lead to civil war between those who live in a country and those who don't. So there's a huge knock-on effect to all of these issues. And that connectivity is very, very consequential in terms of people's lives and our future. So what do we do to solve for all of this? How did we get here? How do we stay optimistic after what has been, in most parts of the world, 7 months of a climate crisis, of a COVID crisis, in addition to the climate crisis, and in addition to the fallout of that, including the Black Lives Matter movement? And so let's get some perspective on this, because this connectivity between issues is something that's really, really becoming top of mind for people. There was actually an article in the Wall Street Journal just in the last couple of days how impact investors are now recognizing that these often abstract issues like climate and so on have huge social knock-on effects that have huge impact in terms of people's livelihoods, and whether that, food scarcity and access to education and social justice, these things are all connected. And if you look at the timeline of the response of business, it's instructive to see that, in the 80s and 90s, there was this new conversation growing up around CSR, corporate social responsibility. But to a large degree, it was limited to supply chain management, operations, and really about cost savings and compliance with regulations. Then in the 90s and 2000s, we saw the rise of this conversation around being sustainable with a small s and then a large s, where you started to talk about the governance of an organization and its internal procedures and how you're treating employees and the environmental and social impact of a company. And then more recently, in the early 2000s, you've heard the rise of this conversation around purpose. When I wrote We First, my first book, one of the chapters was really titled, The Future of Profit is Purpose. And here we are 10 years later. And only in the last 2 or 3 years have we seen this really rise to the top. And what that looks like is, the commitments towards the sustainable development goals, the marriage of purpose and profit, this awareness of the mega trends driving the impact on our lives and on business and the role of business within that, and really to embed and integrate purpose in a very intentional way. And you could characterize this shift as an evolution from doing less bad in your supply chain, polluting rivers, making products that do harm, through to more good. In fact, we're heading towards a very interesting territory where we're moving beyond more good to even having a net positive effect. And we'll talk about that in a second. But if we were to sort of oversimplify this dialogue around capitalism, just to give us a bit of a timeline, there's a meme going around right now, which is kind of interesting, which is where it all started. The Milton Friedman doctrine, the social responsibility of business is to increase its profit. That is it. Your fiduciary duty to your shareholders is the number one, only overriding priority of companies. And then more recently, across so many platforms, you've seen a reaction to, well, how's that going for everyone? How's it working out? And you see, this New York Times title, Shareholder Value is no longer everything, top CEOs say, which was, an article in response to the declaration by the 181 CEOs of the Business Roundtable, who said that we need to shift the purpose of a corporation from, shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, to really serve all of those who have a stake in our future, a stake in society, consumers, citizens, employees, suppliers, everyone across the board. And so this experiment that's been going on since the 1970s, which sort of enabled a winner-takes-all, me-first approach to capitalism, has, in many minds today, business minds, politicians, thought leaders, academics, overplayed its hand at great cost to humanity, really imperiling our future. And so, this has shown up in ways that are encouraging, because it's not just those that are predisposed to do good in the world, the nonprofits, foundations, NGOs, responsible brands, the social enterprises of the world that are saying that. But here, for example, we see Larry Fink, who's the CEO of the largest hedge fund in the world that manages about $7.6 trillion in assets, and whose annual letters are a real bellwether to stock markets around the world, saying that companies and investors with a strong sense of purpose and a long-term approach will be better able to navigate this crisis and its aftermath. And across his 3 different annual letters, he's really called out the need for stakeholder capitalism. And his most recent letter was actually entitled A Fundamental Restructuring of the Capital Markets, where he said that the climate crisis is going to force us to do things differently in the capital markets. The stock markets are going to be fundamentally shifted in favor of those companies that are set up for a sustainable future, because we have to really look not only to the impact work we do, but where people invest their money, they've got to invest it responsibly in companies that are set up to survive in this very different reality we now find ourselves. And it's interesting, I mentioned the Business Roundtable CEOs in that article, and it was great to see that declaration of intent a couple of years ago. But very quickly and quite rightly, CEOs, that are B corporations, benefit corporations that have actually built such a commitment into the articles of incorporation in their companies, did a full page out of the New York Times and said, okay, that's great. Let's get to work, dear Business Roundtable CEOs, and called them out on it. And it's interesting, there's been a lot of scrutiny in the last couple of years as to how those companies are doing. Are they walking their talk? And we'll talk more about that in a minute. And so, beyond this timeline from CSR through sustainability to purpose, we're now looking very clearly down the lens of stakeholder capitalism. And it's been given lots of different names, each of which have very different meanings, but the common gist of which is really serving all people. So you've got regenerative, inclusive, sustainable, collaborative, accountable, transformative. All of these different sort of ways to express this inclusive approach to capitalism, where all stakeholders are considered, are now top of mind in the press, at Davos, at the World Economic Forum, in our newspapers every day, heads of state, industry captains speaking to this. And it really is about what is next for capitalism if we are to thrive as human beings and also survive on this precious planet. And so how do we reorientate capitalism for our future? And here you see a recent New York Times article saying, a free market manifesto that changed the world, reconsidered. Milton Friedman's libertarian economics influenced presidents and inspired greed is good. Remember that Wall Street film in the 80s? Michael Douglas with too much hair product. So what did Friedman get right and what did he get wrong? And you see various opinions out there by different thought leaders. And let's look at the spectrum of opinions, because no issue is all black and all white. There's always shades of gray out there. And so, we need to acknowledge that focusing on maximizing profits alone has really accelerated these compounding crises, because that capital generation, that profit, has come at the cost of, damn the consequences, pollution, disparity of wealth, the compromise of the environment on so many levels. And what Mark Benioff says here when he's disagreeing with Friedman, just at the end here, and he actually called out, capitalism at the World Economic Forum, saying capitalism as we know it is dead. He says here at the bottom, it's time for a new kind of capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, which recognizes that our companies have a responsibility to all our stakeholders. Yes, that includes shareholders, but also employees, customers, communities, and the planet. And as one of the world's largest and most successful and profitable companies that is deeply committed through their platform of Ohana to give back, people listen to his opinion. At the same time, you get other industry leaders pushing back, like Ken here, the founder of Home Depot, who has a slightly different perspective, a more calibrated perspective, where he said, but if we ignore Friedman's crystalline perception that profits are the driving focus, then the entire mission, goodwill included, falls apart. When we turn the idea of profit into a callous slur, as Friedman's laziest critics often do, we're demeaning the essential propelling force that enables all of these interconnected good works to occur. Now, I don't agree with him. I don't think, that most commentators are lazy and that they, treat profit as a slur. I think a lot of them say that we've got to calibrate profit and purpose. And I think the exception to the rule says profit is bad. And so I agree with him in principle that you need both. Without a margin, you don't have a mission. But I don't agree with the fact that, with a broad brush, that he's saying that Friedman's critics are actually criticizing profit outright. I think that's a very, very small minority. But the point is well taken, that if a company isn't profitable, it doesn't matter how good your intentions are or the good works are that you're creating, the whole system will come falling down because the companies themselves can't survive. And then you get, folks like Howard Schultz, who was the CEO and chairman of Starbucks, one of the most profitable companies for a long time, global brands, who's now executive or emeritus chairman of Starbucks. And they've done so many initiatives over time: same-sex marriage, post-traumatic stress disorder, online education for veterans, employment for refugees, so many different issues. And what he says here is, halfway down, the ethos fueling those efforts, that companies have a responsibility to enhance the societies in which they flourish, was integral to Starbucks' ability to employ great people and attract customers. So two very bottom line ROIs here, returns on investment, great people, employees, and attract customers, which in turn drove a 21,000% return to shareholders between 1992 and 2018, which is when he stepped down as chairman. A 21,000% return as a function of what he says was the purpose integral to Starbucks. And so, on one side, you've got Mark Benioff saying capitalism is dead. You've got Ken from Home Depot on the other saying, yeah, but we need profits as well, which is a fair call. And you've got Howard Schultz saying they've got to come together. And so this is, a nuanced argument. And it's so top of mind today because people are really working out how to calibrate capitalism so that we all have a future to look forward to. I think if anything, 2020, which is almost like a curse word now, like how you feeling 2020, you know, it's I think in years to come, I think New Year's Eve this year, everyone, the clock strikes midnight and we're all just going to just say, you know, 2020 on your way. Thank you so much for showing up in so many different ways that have been tragic in terms of the loss of life, have compromised so many people's lives, and so many of us will be so grateful just to see the back of it. But really, let's talk about how it's really going. Because, you know, we're staunch believers in capitalism and its ability to drive growth and competition, and on the strength of that to scale impact. But, you know, talking is one thing and walking your talk is another. And here's a collection of different things from the press in the last couple of weeks. You know, stakeholder capitalism gets a report card, it's not good. So there's a research organization called True Value that actually did an assessment of how those 181 companies, you know, and the CEOs of the Business Roundtable have actually walked their talk. And really, a lot of them are not showing up in the way that they need to. And some might argue that it's one thing to, you know, the first necessary stage is for them to do a shared public declaration and to pay lip service to this topic. But the timelines we're working against don't allow for that. Whether it's 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, or 15 years, whether it's the Arctic, which is collapsing before our eyes. You know, the Guardian last week had a report that came out and said 1/5 of countries around the world are experiencing ecosystem collapse in terms of biodiversity. Whether it's extreme weather from fires in California and Australia to, you know, hurricanes and tornadoes, whether it's floods in Venice, we're out of time. Climate crisis doesn't care about our agenda or our attention or our bandwidth. And at the same time, you've got those companies that are showing up more meaningfully, sending mixed signals. For example, Salesforce lays off around 1,000 people despite having a monster quarter during COVID. And, you know, there are always many complex factors that go into why companies and CEOs make decisions like this, but it does send mixed signals out there. You know, the illusory promise of stakeholder governance, that we're going to actually govern our companies and our leadership in a new way. You know, and this a test of corporate purpose, this TCP assessment of how companies were showing up in and around inequality around COVID-19. And, you know, for example, New York Attorney General, you know, scrutinizing Amazon for firing workers during this time when Amazon had record profits. And, you know, very few of the Business Roundtable CEOs actually submitted their letter, their declaration of intent, their commitment towards stakeholder capitalism for approval or implementation in terms of governance of their companies. Meanwhile, climate crisis is affecting their supply chains. Meanwhile, their lack of action is affecting their ability to attract top talent. Meanwhile, consumers are acutely aware with the daily diet of media as to the challenges we face and are becoming more and more intentional as to which companies they support by voting with their dollars, especially the younger demographics. And so business is on the hook and there's nowhere to hide. And there are encouraging signs, though. This conversation continues to move forward. You know, Walmart gave a very powerful announcement recently, which was announced the goal to become a regenerative company. And for a long time, we've heard about companies becoming sustainable, but really nature isn't sustainable by nature. It is regenerative. You know, it renews, it restores, it kind of brings back life through this cycle of regeneration. And this allows for companies to be net positive, to restore the damage that was done, to operate in a way that is actually going to address and fix the problems that we're solving for, not just do less harm. And so there are reasons to feel optimistic. And so you know, there is this tension as we head in this direction between capitalism and socialism, and this being a presidential election year. And, you know, you saw the various, you know, parties had their debates within their own leadership. Issues around the distinction between capitalism and socialism were top of mind. Socialism has been demonized in a lot of ways. Capitalism has been exploited in a lot of ways. And, you know, not to oversimplify the topic, but, you know, here's a nice statement of it that just came out from, you know, Project Syndicate. Although it can be politically expedient to draw a thick line between capitalist decentralization and socialist central planning, the truth is that the two systems have converged on many occasions. Moreover, each was conceived for the same purpose, and elements of both could be realized in today's digital economy. And you see this playing out around socialized medicine and all of these different, debates that are going on right now. And so, they're both trying to solve for the same issue in some way, which is, how do you really improve the life of the greatest number of people in a way that's respectful of humanity and the planet? And so I just wanted to call that out, because too often this idea of a more responsible capitalism is then mischaracterized as some sort of socialist agenda, when at the same time, the very premise of that evolution of capitalism is to serve more people more effectively. And so how do we get there? How do we actually start to solve for these issues? Because it is complicated. And, just in very broad stroke terms, and you're seeing these play out across so many companies around the world, large and small, B2B, B2C, you can define your purpose, which is why the company exists. You can then build an inclusive culture around that, inclusive not just of all of your employees and all of your departments and all of your functional roles, but of all stakeholders, from suppliers to manufacturers to production to distributors, to all of your employees, to your partners, to consumers, to citizens, and to the industry that you're in and the world at large. And then scale across your industry and beyond the impact that you're going to have as a function of that purpose. And sometimes, I got to be honest with you, I scratch my head about all of this work that we do here at WeFirst, inside all the marketing firms out there that are helping companies trying to be purposeful, inside all the companies that are reengineering what they're doing. I mean, it should be self-evident in business that you need to take something to market that adds value to people's lives and justifies you earning a profit without compromising the future of humanity and the planet. I think that was a presumption of business, perhaps a naive one, in the 40s and 50s, ever since the Industrial Revolution, excuse me. But what has happened is that over several decades, we became drunk on the power of media, where, as you heard, the medium became the message. How we shared something actually was the message. It became so powerful. We see this playing out in politics right now, and we see the distortion of it across social media. And over time, our ability to manipulate people's thinking and behavior and ultimately purchasing habits distorted that original intent of business. And I think what's happened over the last several decades is we've started to peel that back. Why? Because, the web, social media, smartphones has empowered consumers and citizens around the world to look at all of these issues and call out brands, call out institutions, call out organizations as to the integrity of their intent. And so when I look at sustainability or CSR and then purpose, and then maybe later on it'll be transparency and accountability and so on, all we're doing is peeling back these disingenuous layers, that sort of atrophied, that calcified the original intent of business. And so in a sense, we're not learning something new, we're remembering what we forgot. And that is that we've got to go to business with a product or service that is going to really add value to people's lives and serve our future. And so now we've got these incredible marketplace opportunities where companies are actually innovating to solve for all of these issues of our own making, these disasters we created. And there's a huge opportunity for companies to lean into that and to drive relevance and meaning with all stakeholders by solving for these issues. And so let's have a look at some companies that are doing that. And these are just a few that have come across our radar, in the last several months. For example, Grove Collaborative, which is, a company which has got a purpose-led stakeholder business model, whose goal is really to be the first and only plastic neutral retailer in the world. Think about that. A global CPG that is plastic neutral. And so all of their products are sustainable. All of them are responsible. And all of them look at their supply chain through new eyes. So Grove Collaborative. Or let's look at Thrive Works. Thrive Farmers is a coffee brand, and they have a foundation called Thrive Works, And it really advocates for a unique theory of change where they take their products like coffee and give 50% of the proceeds of that back to the farmers on the land. And they allow the farmers to own those products, the beans and so on, to the port of sale when it leaves the country of origin. And that cuts out a lot of the middlemen that otherwise took away those profits. So it allows them to pay it back to those farmers and invest it back in those communities, in their education, in their infrastructure, allowing them to become more self-sustaining. And so it really is teaching them to fish rather than giving them fish. And so the whole goal they have is to disrupt poverty. And the tool of their trade is coffee and teas and other things that are coming. Or if you look at another expression of capitalism, Cook's venture is taking on the poultry industry, which really there's a stranglehold. I don't know if people know this, the stranglehold on the poultry industry by a company like Tyson, which, as I understand it, controls 90% of the poultry industry here in the US, and even more so, 95% around the world. I believe those statistics are correct. They may not be, so correct me if I'm wrong. And what they've done is they're providing an ecosystem, a regenerative ecosystem solution. Because here's the issue. If you're just nibbling away at the edges of an industry to recalibrate capitalism, but the reality is behind the scenes that a few companies or one company control the vast majority of the industry, you're just really beating your head against the wall. You're not going to change anything. Instead, you need to look at the entire value chain of an industry and provide a viable solution that is profitable and responsible, so there is a legitimate alternative to people to support, enable, and grow. And that's the only way it's going to be a realistic alternative to what is currently being done, for example, with industrial farming right now, which comes at a huge cost to not only animals' lives, but ecology more broadly. And so, here is a company, Cook's Venture, that is looking to disrupt the chicken industry based on this regenerative model. If we then look at another example, Bombas, that is a sock company that some of you may have heard of or seen their ads on television more recently. They are really a purpose with a business rather than a business with a purpose, which is something we talk about at We First here all the time. And what they do is, a pair of socks is given for every pair of socks that are sold. But in order to make that viable, they did deep research to make sure that they're putting the best socks out there in the world. And then, they address the homeless issue because, through their own research, they found that a pair of socks is the #1 most requested item of homeless people. Then #2 is underwear. And then #3 is t-shirts. And I recently interviewed their CEO, recently, and he was sharing how they're expanding into these categories to really build the first lifestyle brand built around homelessness. Think about that for a second. They're reverse engineering a brand out of what the homeless need so they can sell to you what the homeless person needs so that that equivalent one can be given to them. It's kind of like a reverse engineering of a brand. A very, very powerful idea by deeply, deeply committed people. And to date, they've given over 40 million pairs of socks. And as someone who lives in LA here, driving to work this morning, the amount of homelessness that is on the rise as a fallout of the economy, of COVID, of companies closing, of employees being furloughed and laid off, of evictions, and just of a long-term systemic issue is absolutely heartbreaking and on the rise all around the country and around the world. And, brands like Bombas are taking on very real and very sad issues. If we also look at a company like Ripple, Adam Lowry was a co-founder of Ripple, and he started Method, the cleaning product company before. And what he's doing with Ripple is taking on the dairy industry, because if you've all heard probably around the dialogue around the climate crisis, the dairy industry plays a huge role, both in the gas that cows emit from both ends, as well as the impact on land and agriculture in terms of providing for cattle, much as you see around palm oil harvesting, clearing forests and losing biodiversity to actually make way for the harvesting or the these agricultural practices that serve the dairy industry and others. And so Ripple is very intentional about the meaningful impact it can have, because its products are based on a pea protein, where they're giving you great tasting dairy equivalents. But you can see here the company is named on the basis of the ripple effect they can have by addressing this issue. And you see here listed the carbon saved, the sugar saved, the water saved, the protein added, and the plastic saved, as a model for business to give consumers what they want at a competitive price point with all the health benefits that you need, without the attending negative effects, negative externalities on the environment and our future. And then you can also look at a brand like Omaze, which has a very powerful impact model, where they scale impact creatively by creating causes. And what they do is they ask people to donate money, not donate money, pay $10, pay $15, pay $50 towards these different causes. And it's a prize model, so that, you know, the winner then receives these incredible prizes, these massively disproportionate prizes. And so they're taking a sort of for-profit, consumer-focused approach to motivating people to contribute to causes that need to be addressed. And so they deliver that money to charity by giving people these incredible experiences. And just a couple more. Olivera out of London. You know, we all know fashion brands, luxury brands, more often than not do have some sort of give back through their CSR, corporate social responsibility, corporate citizenship, or, you know, philanthropic efforts or sustainability efforts. But Olivera in London, they actually built a platform where 20% of gross proceeds of their sales, not their net profit, is actually given to causes. And what they found was, you can actually get a discount on those luxury, premium, high-priced items from the brands you respect and love, super elevated luxury brands, and not only save on those products by buying it on Olivera, but then 20% of those proceeds go to giving back. And it was started by the CEO of Olivera and Malala, you know, who we all know through, you know, her incredibly inspiring life journey, all in service of education to young women. And so this is a platform created specifically for other luxury brands to sell their products and have a very meaningful percentage of gross sales to go to young women's education around the world. Again, a very interesting model. And then finally, Thankyou, which is an Australian company, which is really challenging brands to collaborate to scale their impact. And just in the last few weeks, they've demanded, you know, a global partnership deal from Unilever and P&G, and calling on the public to apply some pressure on those brands to make it happen, because they want to end poverty. And so, you know, a very interesting model of a company in Australia. I mean, that's a long way away, as I understand it. Taking on two of the biggest CPG companies in the world, if not the biggest, Procter & Gamble and Unilever, two otherwise competitors, to rally around an issue larger than themselves. Very, very inspiring, disruptive, and, you know, we'll be tracking with interest, you know, how that goes and the consumer support for that. And then really, the last one I'd like to point to is, you know, B corporations. You might say these are all different models in different ways that are solving for these issues, but I wanted to include this because it's a way for any company, no matter what industry you're in, to institutionalize values that align with people and planet and stakeholder capitalism into your articles of incorporation. And so, you know, you become a B Corp. And it's a rigorous test where they look at your supply chain, your culture, your products, your impact, and you've got to hit a certain number of points that then qualify you to be a B Corp. And every couple of years, you've got to qualify again. And not only does that apply to small businesses, but they've actually got large corporations out there. They've got this B Movement Builders platform for large corporations like Danone, which is the largest B Corp, Danone North America, you know, which makes yogurt and all those other things. And it really is about leading a global movement where companies of all sizes are held accountable through their B Corp status as to how they're showing up in the world. And it is all about, you know, being inclusive, equitable, and regenerative coalition of companies that will really shore up our future. And you can see some of the large corporations that are involved in that as well. And so, this whole dialogue around capitalism, stakeholder capitalism and its role in our future is very dynamic right now. It's very contentious in some ways because even for those with the best of intentions, it implies a re-engineering of their business, innovation, absorbing capital costs, behaving and thinking in new ways at a time when COVID and protests around the world and climate crisis are really just kneecapping the global economy and really, for some companies, forcing them on their back feet to say, we've just got to survive, while other companies are responding by leaning into becoming more purposeful, not just because we need to solve for these issues, but by solving for those issues, they're ensuring their own relevance to stakeholders, internal and external, and for the future. So you're seeing a variety of responses. And before we go to questions, and I would please ask you to enter those questions into the chat box, just click on that Q&A button. A lot of what we share on WeFirst comes from the fact that we're lucky enough to talk to all of these great companies that are doing the meat and potatoes work of driving profit while also having a positive impact. And a little while ago, a few months ago, maybe even 5 months ago now, we decided, hey, why should we be the only ones who get to the privilege of hearing on the inside of what's going on? Let's share that with everyone. Not about the need to do good, but how you actually get it done. And so we started this podcast called Lead with We, which you can find at leadwithwe.com. And every single week, I'm interviewing somebody that is really changing the way that business is done, that is practicing this new form of capitalism. And we've had CEOs and CMOs and presidents of Vans and North Face and Tom's and VF Corporation and IBM and all of these amazing brands, Ripple Foods that I mentioned, that are just sharing how they're showing up in the world, as well as small brands like Jenny's Ice Cream and Green Bar Distillery here in LA, showing up in new ways that is, number one, driving growth for their business, but number two, having an impact as well. So I would encourage you to kind of enjoy this diet of insights that will really equip you to succeed in the future by going to leadwithwe.com. It's on Apple, Google, and Spotify. And subscribe, and please rate and review, because when you rate and review, it allows you to be more seen in terms of the algorithm. It ranks it higher, more people will see it, and therefore more companies, more businesses can benefit from the insights of these amazing business people. And I'm just provoking them with questions. Everyone's sharing, their insights, their learnings, their mistakes. So leadwithwe.com. And then, here are three of the people you can hear about. Kara from Hintwater, they're the fourth largest beverage company in the US, and they're privately owned. And she started it as a mum with 3 kids, pregnant with her 4th kid. Adam Lowry, I mentioned, who started Method with Ripple Foods. David Heath, who started Bombas. Imagine you could learn what they are doing to drive growth at a time when, all of us need to do that, and we need to solve for our future. So just 3 of the recent guests that have been on there. And then let's go to questions. And, you can always fire a question to me at simon@wefirstbranding.com if you're looking to kind of position your brand and integrate your purpose and take it to market. But I really, really appreciate people's questions. So let's dive into them. All right. So, and for those of you who aren't sure, just go down to the bottom of the screen. You'll see a dialog box or a box pop up, and you just click on the Q&A button and you can enter the question in the chat. So a question from Ken. Is there a chance that purposeful business could decline as we look to government in the wake of COVID and businesses focus again on providing escape or leisure? How do we advocate for business in this time when people are looking to government? It's an interesting question, Ken, because I think people historically by default look to government, but I think if there's any narrative out there right now, particularly here in the US, the government hasn't shown up in a way that it should when we need it most. Specific to the COVID issue, but also related to other issues, racial inequality, social justice, so many other things this year. So I understand the question. I think as we come out of COVID, which looks like it's going to go through 2021 now for sure, We're going to look to government to kind of institutionalize systems that will protect us in and around COVID. But we're also going to look to business to continue to play a meaningful role in driving change. Why? Because the way that business shows up was extraordinary. The way that people rallied around with their employees as they were retooling their own business and going remote, the way that they showed up can't be unseen. You know, we now know that business can turn on a dime, innovate overnight, and provide responses at scale when the stakes are high enough. And so we're going to continue to look at individual companies and business more broadly to really be a meaningful player in these solutions. And I would almost say that business is better equipped than government, because government has all the inertia of partisan politics, as we see here in the US, you know, all the inertia around, you know, this new COVID relief bill and so on. Yet business is out there showing up in meaningful ways, whether it's a local restaurant providing meals to first responders or medical practitioners in hospitals, or whether it's companies like Tesla and Dyson innovating to create PPE equipment and ventilators and so on. So I think that a business is better equipped, and so we're going to continue to look for them. And after this experience and the dramatic effect of COVID on everyone, I think employees will drive businesses to do it, let alone consumers. Let's go to the next question. Amy, how do we stand out in the marketplace if everyone's purpose ultimately just means stakeholder capitalism? It's a great question. You know, one of the challenges and one of the things we focus on in our work here at WeFirst is really to help brands define a distinct conversation that they're leading that is specific to the role they're playing. Because you're right, saying you're sustainable doesn't cut it anymore. The same way saying you are green doesn't cut it anymore. Saying you're committed to stakeholder capitalism doesn't cut it anymore. You have to define your specific purpose and then articulate how that's going to come to life. What issues are you going to address? And then go one step further, which is, what is your point of view on those issues? For example, you've got a nonprofit like Livestrong, which after Lance Armstrong has stepped away and Nike stopped being a sponsor, you know, they've always really been focused on caretakership, looking after cancer survivors and those that care for them, which is very different to those other nonprofits, you know, raising funds for cancer research, for example. Or, you know, if you look at Airbnb, you know, there are many other companies providing apartments and homes that you can rent on a temporary basis, but they're committed to universal belonging. And that's why they gave free accommodation to Syrian refugees and more. So you've got to get very specific about, as an extension of your purpose, as how stakeholder capitalism is manifesting in the impact you're going to have. And that way you'll cut through, that way it can inform your marketing, and your marketing will show up in very different ways so that you can unlock the ROI of doing this work. Thank you for that, Amy. That's a great question, because I think, you know, whether it's being green, sustainable, purposeful, stakeholder capitalism, it's very easy to get lost. So John W., it seems like so many big players who can afford to collaborate or have many stakeholders can speak to this. How do small players show up? You know, it's really interesting. The wonderful thing about purpose is that it's not dependent on size. There is no limit to the breadth of your ambition, whether you're a solopreneur sitting at your kitchen table or working in your garage. In fact, I would suggest, you know, larger companies that have been around for a century have all the inertia of all the capital investments in the way that things have always been done, and how they retool all of that and how they recoup those costs and so on. So if you're a young startup brand, you can be as aspirational as you want. And the way that you scale your impact is to work with others. And by that, I mean not just your employees and your consumers to create programs that have impact, but also competitors or like-minded individuals, nonprofits, NGOs, foundations that want to work with you, or also competitors who care about the same thing. And you work with them to scale your impact. And when you do that, you don't just collect individual eyeballs as you start to grow your business. You collect communities of eyeballs, which will dramatically accelerate the adoption of your brand, your products and services, and ultimately your impact. So if you're a small brand, you're more agile, you're more nimble, you're less encumbered by the past, and you've got a greater opportunity to collaborate with people on the strength of a clearly defined purpose to make a real difference in the world. So don't see it as a limitation, see it as an advantage, and just put that sweat equity in. Let's have a look at the next question. Doug, what do you see as the next step beyond stakeholder capitalism if you can look that far in the future? You know, it's a good question, but I would sort of pause in the sense that I've seen a couple of articles in the last 6 months, you know, purpose is dead or purpose is over. I don't know. I didn't get the memo. I didn't see when every company got clearly articulate about their purpose and integrated it effectively and took it to market with transparency and accountability. I didn't see that. If it happened, please let me know. And so before we rush past purpose or even question stakeholder capitalism, as we saw with the business roundtable, CEOs and companies, and with the, you know, the true value report, we've got a long way to go until we really recognize that the fundamental come from of all of those companies and all companies should be, what is the positive role you're playing in the world that can deliver a profit for you so you can grow and thrive as a business without compromising our future and the planet. So there's a long way to go. Beyond stakeholder capitalism, what I think we're going to see more and more is, sadly, these issues that we're solving for, these challenges, are enormous. The climate crisis doesn't care about our timelines, as I said, and the planet will be fine without humanity. In which case, as they become more acute, we're going to see business collaborating and innovating in new ways. We're going to have to work together in new ways. Competitors are going to have to work together to level up their industries and stop doing harm. You know, sectors are going to have to work together in new ways. I think we're going to have to scale our response, and that will allow us to accelerate it, you know, our response, and also condense our timeline, because we don't really have the luxury of time anymore. I was thinking about this the other day. You know, for decades, if not centuries, we always thought that time was this sort of indefinite resource. Sure, we had, you know, a limited number of years that we have on the planet, but time is always going to be there. There'll always be a future for humanity. But I think COVID has really woken up a lot of people to the fact that we are fragile and we can disappear, and time isn't a given for us individually or collectively as a species, in which case we need to be mindful of timelines that are independent of this idea that is no longer true. You know, we need to say, we need to act now at scale with intention, because otherwise we're not going to solve for the issues that will compromise our very existence. So I think we'll be innovating and collaborating in new ways. And next question, Sarah, do companies have to become more like activists to enshrine stakeholder capitalism, or is it more of a voluntary thing? It's an interesting question. I mean, I've seen articles about activist CEOs. You've seen so much consumer activism, citizen activism around the Black Lives Matter movement. You've seen, you know, employees calling out their CEOs and leadership. You've seen it with Google. You've seen it with Amazon. And so I think all of us, whatever hat we wear in the stakeholder coalition, are going to become more activists. We need to take action to drive change, not just in our own personal lives and our communities, but in business, whether it's an employee challenging our CEO to do something, whether it's a consumer, you know, calling out a brand for the way they're showing up, or moving to another brand because they're showing up in a more responsible way. I think all of us now are going to have to use our dollars, the role we play in the world, our communities, the influence we have, our social media, how we talk to our children, how we live our lives, what products we buy, what we consume, how well informed we are about what we buy and why we buy it, and to put it to better use. Because it's almost like for decades, we've been oblivious to the responsibility we all have. And, you know, one of the things I feel very strongly about with stakeholder capitalism is we don't just have a right to the benefits of capitalism beyond the shareholder. We have an obligation to the responsibilities of stakeholder capitalism. And that means we've all got to show up individually in meaningful ways that will make a difference. And we have one more question here is, oh, that's interesting. With all of these challenges we face, what gives you cause for optimism? I appreciate the personal question, Ted. You know, why am I optimistic? I believe that capitalism is moving in the right direction. I believe that for the first time, we're getting the necessary coalition of stakeholders together. And that includes investors, consumers, employees, and more. And I believe that we've been given this rude wake-up call through COVID that we are fragile, we are perilous, and that we could disappear as a species as a function of what we've done to our planet. And on the strength of that, I believe in the innate goodness of humanity. I believe in our deep and fundamental connection to the planet. And I believe that we're going to show up in meaningful ways because we are so ingenious and so creative when we have to solve for something that is meaningful to us. And there's nothing more meaningful than our survival. And so, yeah, I'd like to end on that note of optimism. If there's any questions you have about your brand, you can reach me at simon@wefirstbranding.com. I do encourage you to listen, subscribe, rate, and review to Lead with We, and also to check out Lead with We, because there's a link there to the book that I have coming out next year, and you can sort of put in your email and you'll be first to hear about that. But most importantly, let's each and every one of us do everything we can to be safe ourselves, to take care of each other, and to slowly retool the way we live our lives in these very difficult circumstances with COVID, so that we can accelerate that timeline, condense that timeline in terms of how business is showing up and how we're rewarding business for acting in new ways. So I trust everyone is safe and well. Wear a mask, stay safe, take care of each other, make sure you get out and vote, and let's build a better future together. Thanks so much.